Record. Okay, we're on now.
Yes.
Okay, take two. All right, welcome to this lecture. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. David Bassano. He has taught history here at Brookdale since 2012. He holds a PhD from SUNY Albany in International, Global, and Comparative History, specializing in the history of human rights. In particular, he's interested in studying human rights as political and social power, focusing primarily on human rights NGOs and their strategies, as well as the human rights implications of climate change. He's the author of Fight and Flight, the Central American Human Rights Movement in the United States in the 1980s. This is available on Amazon UK and at Cambridge Scholars Publishing. In addition to his academic publications, Dr. Bassano has also published Travelin's Wager, and that is a fictional text. As if all of this weren't enough, Dr. Bassano also maintains a human rights education channel on YouTube. We are going to also put this video on the GCP channel on YouTube, and I imagine it will be up there as well. I will put that YouTube channel in the chat for you all. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to David for his presentation.
Thank you, Kelsey. Appreciate that. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon from where I am, Keyport, New Jersey. So yes, let me do a share screen. Now, the one thing I can't do as I go through this presentation is I don't think I can look at my notes in the chat at the same time. I'll see if I see a hand raised or something like that. As far as I'm concerned, if you have a question as I'm going along, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your, cut in on me and ask your question. That's the easiest way. So share screen.
And I can also monitor the chat as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so you see the beginning of PowerPoint, and I bring up my notes. So you've got the PowerPoint, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. I should probably be able to see that too. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today is the relationship between ACC, anthropogenic climate change, which means human-caused climate change, and human rights, as per the international system of human rights. And, you'll hear a lot of talk about climate change as kind of this left-wing conspiracy theory that it's being done to introduce like worldwide global socialism by the Rockefellers or whoever, is the big boogeyman today. Who does believe or takes climate change very seriously and accepts it as fact is the Department of Defense of the United States. And the Department of Defense is interested in how climate change is going to change the world in the future. Climate change can cause flooding. It's going to cause flooding due to sea level rise in coastal areas, which can cause civil unrest and possibly civil war in coastal regions. If there's going to be a civil war or unrest in a coastal region, the Marine Corps wants to know about that beforehand so they can do their planning. The naval base at Norfolk, Virginia is already flooding 20 times a year. So ACC, anthropogenic climate change, is something that is beginning now. It is happening now. The temperatures are rising now. The sea levels are rising now. So the military is interested in, okay, well, how do we keep Norfolk running? How do we keep the base from flooding? I think the biggest challenge that the military sees is in the Arctic, because the sea ice is melting up above the Arctic Circle. And it is discovered that there are oil and natural gas reserves totaling perhaps 233 billion barrels of oil or its equivalent under the seafloor, as well as other mineral wealth. And the militaries of Russia and Canada and the United States and Norway, they're all rushing up to the Arctic Circle. They're building new bases. They're having cold weather exercises. What they want is when the ice melts, they want to go up and stake their claim to the undersea oil. Now, this isn't real encouraging. They're accepting that climate change is real. Climate change is going to melt the ice. So therefore, we can go get the fossil fuels and burn it and fry the planet some more. So you see that they are taking this seriously. They're putting their money where their mouth is. Unfortunately, exactly what they have in mind is a little depressing. Okay, ACC. What is it? I'm switching back and forth between my notes is what I'm doing here. This is the theory that climate change is not just due to natural causes, as past climate shifts on planet Earth have been, but due mainly to human activity. And this is what the 98% of climate scientists believe, climatologists, and they can see in how fast the temperature is rising on planet Earth and how fast the CO2 is increasing, that this is indeed a man-made phenomenon. And the CO2 is a greenhouse gas up in the atmosphere. It causes heat, sunlight, which reaches planet Earth and is reflected back. That heat cannot radiate out back into space, creating an equilibrium as it wants to do. But the CO2 is a greenhouse gas. The infrared light bounces back off of it and comes back to Earth, which means we're not shedding as much heat as we used to, which means the temperature is building up on planet Earth, just the way it would in a greenhouse. It is already happening now. The point of my talk is to demonstrate how this climate change, this ACC, will disrupt human rights around the world. As for the data, I'm not a climatologist. My specialty is human rights, so I'm on the other end of it. As for the climate and the changes that are going to happen, what I'm relying primarily on is the reports of the IPCC. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations. They put out a report, I think it's every 5 years. And they are considered the most reliable in the world for their reporting. They got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for their work. Okay, so what am I talking about in terms of human rights? It's a little harder to establish what human rights are. It tends to get a little subjective. Climate change is easy. You can measure sea level rise. We all have thermometers. You keep an eye on the temperature. We know that's happening. Human rights are a philosophical, moral, and political question. So what I'm going to use as my basis for studying human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was ratified at the United Nations in 1948. This is not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a law, it's not a treatise, it's a declaration of philosophy that other instruments, laws, and treaties will be based on. Now, most of us think in terms of our political rights, the right to vote, to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom from arbitrary arrest and detainment. Most of the rights that are going to be directly violated by climate change are socioeconomic rights. And socioeconomic rights are the rights that give people access to certain basic needs that are necessary to lead a dignified life. Yes, what you need to live free of poverty, free of want, that is considered a human right at the international scale. This is interesting. Most Americans are not real familiar with socioeconomic rights. When we think about our rights in America, we think about the early amendments, right? The Bill of Rights in the US Constitution, and which do not speak about socioeconomic rights. They talk about your political freedoms, freedom of speech and the right to vote and so on. Because historically, back when the Constitution was written, shortly after our revolution, what the founders were all interested in was political freedom, freedom from tyranny, as they called it. That's what they had been fighting against. And also, it was before the Industrial Revolution arrived in America, when all the corporations would step in, and corporations and companies would begin to have a lot more power. Power that the founders never dreamed of. They were worried about kings and tyrants. They did not see the power of corporations coming. They couldn't have. It was before their historic moment. When that happened, though, people's socioeconomic rights became very important. But the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is the international standard. The treaties that come out of it are the ones that have force of law at the International Court of Justice. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These are supposed to be binding on nations. They have to obey them. So these three together, the UDHR and these two international covenants, are called the International Covenant on Human Rights. And the US tends not to have so strong a commitment to socioeconomic rights as the Europeans do. You've heard about the generous social safety net in Europe, the free healthcare, the free education. They consider all of those to be expressions of socioeconomic rights. They pay for them with higher taxes, but they keep agreeing to pay for them. You know, they want it that way. Americans, we have probably the least socialistic country on earth right now. So we do have a social safety net, like Social Security and Section 8 housing and food stamps and so on. It tends to be weaker than in Europe, though. So what are these socioeconomic rights? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, spells these out broadly. Now, it's going to be up to each country to carry these out, depending on how much money they have. There's a lot of poor nations in the world who would like to carry out this program that's listed here, but they don't have the money. It says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And that second clause there is what we call Social Security in the United States. So it says that everyone everywhere around the world has the right to a standard of living that's adequate for your health, for your well-being. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights takes this a second step. Says the states recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, that they will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right. That is to say, it is the government's responsibility to make sure that your socioeconomic rights are followed. So, with those rights set out, we want to see the intersection now of ACC, this climate change which is coming, and our socioeconomic rights. The physical effects of climate change on our environment they're already quite profound, and they're going to become even more obvious and devastating. IPCC says that 2100 is really the year where, if we have not seen the most profound effects of climate change, we're going to see it by 2100. Others say that that's actually a very conservative estimate. That's one thing the IPCC has been accused of, being too conservative in their estimates, because they do it by consensus of scientists, which tends to bring their estimates down to kind of the lowest common denominator, that things could actually be much worse. Exactly what effects are we looking at? What about food production worldwide? The UDHR says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food. But ACC is going to increase temperatures around the world. That is going to have a lot of knock-on effects. Obviously, one of them is going to be drought. The IPCC has said that it expects agricultural yields to decrease for all major cereal crops by 2100 at the latest, in all major areas of production around the world. Also, livestock is going to suffer. Don't have enough water for either the plants or the livestock, and actually a cattle drinks incredible amounts of water to raise one of them. With less food, you're going to get, in the poorer areas of the world, simple starvation. Also, in wealthier areas, food prices are simply going to go up. You're going to have to spend a larger share of your income just to get your hands on the food. Seawater, when it becomes warmer, increases the frequency of hurricanes. It's one of the drivers of it is warm water. So we're going to see an increase in hurricanes, typhoons, major storms, which are going to have major knock-on effects. And you keep seeing this, by the way, over and over again, that one problem feeds into other problems. You know, the whole chain of food security is a very complex web. So the storms disrupt transportation infrastructure, flooding out roads, flooding out bridges. And that, even if you do manage to get the food grown, you have to ship it to the urban areas for people to have access to it. Well, if the roads are all flooded out and if there's, you know, landslides blocking transportation, you can have all the food you want, but people can't get it. What happens when the electrical infrastructure gets taken down? That's common here, even in the United States. In places around the world where the infrastructure is more fragile, it's going to hamper refrigeration. And what would we do if, you know, you lose power for a few days? If you lose it for 5 days, maybe you have to throw things out that are in the fridge. What happens if you lose it for 2 weeks every 2 months? All right, so this is yet more food insecurity that we're going to see. Encroaching seawater causes a problem. It ruins agricultural land. You can't have that salt getting into the fields. This is a problem already in the island of Vanuatu in the Pacific, where people are building seawalls to try to keep the rising sea level out of their communities. But they found that that's not enough to put a wall around the town because the seawater is getting into the agricultural fields and ruining crops, too much salt. And they have to build a seawall now around these gigantic fields that they're growing in, and this is turning out to be impractical. They're going to have to abandon some agricultural land near the coastline. Right along with that is going to be water. The irony of it is some people are going to have too little water and others are going to have way too much. Already today, 790 million people do not have adequate water as per international law. The Human Rights Water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically acceptable, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. This, by the way, is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It was this new version adopted in 2003. Comment number 15 regards water. And drought is obviously going to limit access to fresh water. This chart right here comes from the United Nations. This shows exactly what your right to water means. Between 50 and 100 liters of water per person per day. Look at this, the water source must be within 1,000 meters of your home. Collection time should not exceed 30 minutes. Well, obviously they're not talking about the United States unless you happen to be in Texas at the moment, unfortunately, which is a nice example of the climate taking down the entire infrastructure and threatening people's lives. In certain places around the world, sub-Saharan Africa, yeah, people cannot meet these qualifications. The government can't make it happen. And as I mentioned, there's 790 million people around the world who today can't access this. What happens in a time of drought? You know how the glaciers work. These rivers of ice that build up in the valleys, up in the mountains, it's snow and ice coming off the mountains, and they melt in the summer, in the warm weather, and provide fresh water for the people down farther in the valleys, the glacial melt. But they don't melt so quickly that they're completely melted down. The snow it goes back on in the wintertime, it's replaced. Except that as the temperature is going up, one of our canaries in the coal mine is that the glaciers are disappearing. And you can see this in very dramatic photographs of glaciers around the world. They're melting faster than they're being replaced because the temperature year-round is warm. Half of all the Himalayan glaciers will be significantly reduced by the year 2050, according to the IPCC. 23% of the population depends on that glacial meltwater source. What is China going to do if a quarter of their people can't get fresh water? That is an immediate and dire emergency for a large fraction of the world's population. Furthermore, just like the salt water encroaching on agricultural land, as the sea levels rise, the salt water encroaches into freshwater aquifers on land. It seeps into the underground aquifers and ruins them. Desalinators to remove the salt from water are a possibility, but an extremely expensive and energy intensive one. You really don't want to go that route if you don't have to. So water is going to be a major problem for a lot of people. There's also sea level rise. All right, your right to housing, to be above water is a right according to international law. Obviously, you get the melting of the polar ice caps contributing to the height of the seas. Also, water expands when it's heated, not by a lot. So if you put water in a glass beaker and you heat it up, it will be a little bit higher, a little bit more of it. Oh yeah, just a tiny fraction. Yeah, multiply that by the size of all the oceans and it becomes considerable. So sea level rise is certain to come. They're expecting a rise of as much as 4.5 feet by the year 2100. Now, presently, about 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of a coastline. So flooding along the coast is going to be catastrophic. One scientific paper said that by the year 2100, 200 million people will live below the sea level. If you want to see a good example around here, look at Seabright, New Jersey. That's going under. The entire strip of land is going to be lost. And much of places like Asbury Park are going to be gone by the year 2100. Not only will 200 million people see their homes go under, another 160 million will be affected by high tides and storm surges that come through periodically. Moving people away from sea level rise has already begun. The first was in the year 2005. That island that I mentioned, Vanuatu, in the Pacific, a very low-level island. They had a town that had 100 villagers, and they had to move the entire town. They just couldn't save it. There's no way to build a wall around the whole thing. The island of Kiribati, another Pacific island, low-lying, has already taken action. They've bought for about $9 million. They bought a 20 square kilometer plot of land on the Fiji Islands. Now, Kiribati has about 100,000 residents. Their plan is if they get flooded out, they're going to move the entire population of their nation to this 20 square kilometer plot in the Fiji Islands as at least a temporary measure so they have dry land to go to. This is the kind of plans people are making. Okay, so you managed to do that with 100,000 people. What are you going to do when there's 200 million underwater? Are you just going to go buy some land for somebody? This is going to be a fantastic challenge. How will we handle it? Look at the clock. Okay. There's health and well-being issues, which is of interest to some of the students in this room. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family. Drought, I mean, obviously, aside from nutritional problems coming about from lack of food, lack of fresh water, remember the drought in California that they recently just got out of. They did a study in 2015 and were looking at the health consequences of the drought. It turns out that there was a lot of dust thrown up into the air at this time that had dramatic health impacts allergies, asthma, and other respiratory issues. And what's going to happen when we have that globally, with all the problems that we're going to have? Will the healthcare system be able to respond? Back on Vanuatu, where they had to move that town, what they were finding was not only were they being flooded, but they had an increase of malaria and skin disease, because the flooding causes more standing water, which causes more mosquitoes. And they were seeing these diseases like malaria being spread around by the mosquitoes. As the temperatures increase, you're going to see disease and pests migrating, right? They're down in the tropics right now. Malaria, yellow fever, dengue. They're down in the tropics because it's too cold up here, which, I can't curse this cold right now, but the winter up here sterilizes things and keeps us safe from these kind of problems. Since about 1960, diseases and crop pests have been moving at 3 kilometers per year in the direction of the Earth's poles. They're going where the weather suits them, right? Which they can now afford to move towards the poles, and because the temperatures are increasing outside of the tropical areas. All of these things I've mentioned, what's going to happen to mental health situations, right? The added stress of all of this happening, increasing mood disorders, which is going to lead to domestic violence. It could lead to suicide. So climate change is considered to be a mental health disaster in the making. Your right to Social Security, and it's called Social Security in the United States. What it means is a social safety net to prevent people from falling into abject poverty. Countries are very much like families in that as long as there's plenty of money available, there's not too much fighting. When the money gets tight, this is when people start fighting with each other. It goes for families, it goes for countries. Current estimates say that the entire global economy by 2100 is going to get reduced by between 3 and 13%. That's a very hard calculation to make. That's why there's such a 10% range on that. It depends on which climate scenario we actually get. But you're going to have a knock on the economy. You're going to get a lot of unemployment. There's going to be a lot less public money available. So there's the possibility that your Social Security will get reduced because there's less tax money available to pay for it. And it'll be reduced at exactly the time when people need it most. Again, that's awful irony to the whole thing. It'll lead to smaller social safety nets. Immigration, people trying to get away from these problems. In the year 2017, there were 68.5 million people forcibly displaced by war, for example, which, by the way, was more than in any point in human history. There were fewer people forcibly displaced during World War II than there are now, or 2017. Approximately 1/3 of these people were forced to move, according to the studies, by sudden onset weather events, flooding, forest fires, intense storms. So already 22 to 24 million people around the world are on the move due to severe weather events. It is projected that we're going to have between 150 and 200 million climate change refugees by 2050. And when you look at the way governments of the world respond to these desperate refugees, it's not too encouraging. There are international laws regarding the treatment of refugees, like the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the 67 optional protocol relating to the status of refugees. You do have the right under international law to move within your own country freely, at the moment anyway. But moving across international borders is much, much harder. Now, one of the problems with this is the definition. There's a difference between a refugee and a migrant. Under international law, a refugee is somebody who is fleeing persecution under pain of death. You're the wrong ethnic group, wrong religion, you belong to a union, or some other thing that angered the government, and your life is in danger. And you must flee under pain of death. So you're called a refugee, and you have rights under international law. You're allowed to flee and to apply for asylum in another country. A migrant is someone who leaves for economic reasons. You're looking for better economic opportunities someplace else. Those are not covered under international law. If you're fleeing for economic reasons, you're considered to be a lesser level of immigrant. Now, the problem is already there's not much difference between refugees and migrants. If you're being picked on because of your ethnic group, you're probably not doing well economically, right? Think about Jim Crow laws and how they prevented African Americans from getting a good job or, attending law school or anything like that. But ACC blurs the line between refugees and migrants. Okay, I'm not being persecuted by tyranny, a government, but I am still under pain of death. If I stay where I am, I'm going to literally be underwater. I should have the right to flee and go someplace else. Well, international law hasn't kept up. There's no international law which applies to people fleeing from anthropogenic climate change. They're not on the books yet. Will the existing laws even be followed? Governments are known for blowing off international law when they don't really care to follow it. Who's going to suffer the most? Surprise, surprise, the poor. Poor countries, poor communities within countries don't have the money to adjust to a new situation, right? They're talking about building a seawall around New York City at the cost of, I think it was $10 billion. You can move Norfolk Naval Base, you can build seawalls. Can they do that in Vietnam, in Thailand, and Bangladesh? Right? They don't have that kind of money, or even for that matter, Louisiana, right? Unless you've got a whole lot of money coming out of FEMA or the Army Corps of Engineers shows up, right? They can't, even in America, they won't be able to save everything. Well, the poorer countries of the world are really going to take it on the chin. You will see some commentators argue that we're all responsible for this because all countries of the world are partaking in fossil fuel burning, so that you really can't blame anybody because we're all responsible. Others say, yeah, but the rich countries are consuming way more fossil fuel than the poor ones. Whenever the economy is doing well, the amount of fossil fuels burned increases. And I mean, this is trackable. Remember the whole economic problem, subprime mortgages back in 2008, which took down, actually the entire world economy went down a notch. There's a delay in the track, but you can look at the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And when the US GNP dipped, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere dipped. I mean, like 1 for 1. It was amazing. What removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Economic decline. We see that's a bit of a problem. The politicians don't exactly want to trash the economy now, do they? That's not how you get elected. Although that has been the most effective thing. So the rich countries of the world burn more fuel. They are more responsible for the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere than poor countries are. And yet poor countries are going to be the most vulnerable because they are the least able to adapt. Oops, there we go. Africa is probably the most vulnerable place. They are going to see particularly severe climate change effects. It's just the details of how the climate works in that region. Now, if you couple that with their poverty, which leads to a lack of ability to adapt or to migrate, that means these socioeconomic rights are going to be more or less destroyed and not only violated, the government will not be able to protect socioeconomic rights of these people. The Middle East, certain areas of the Middle East, like Oman, are actually regarded that by 2100 they are going to be unlivable. They'll be so hot and dry that no one will be able to live there. The Middle East is a threatened area. So is Southeast Asia. The flooding, the typhoons, the lack of money to be able to mitigate the effects. And as I mentioned, even within wealthy countries, not all communities are the same. Not all communities have the same amount of money. Will the poor states be able to adapt to all this? And if the people have to flee, where are they going to go with nothing more than the clothes on their back? As you can see, this is all shaping up to be a disaster, a human rights catastrophe. So it's shaping up to be a catastrophe, but unfortunately what I'm discovering in my readings, and by the way, studying ACC and human rights is a new emerging field. There's not that much work that's been done yet, but it's quickly growing. People are really taking up this issue and reading up on this scholarship. What's clear is that the world is not ready to face this threat at all. Nothing is ready. Our politics aren't, our economics aren't, our international laws and treaties are not. One of the basic problems is that the international system is predicated on separation instead of unity. It's predicated on all of us being independent nations. The UN is not some kind of world cop that can force all the nations of the world to do this or that, not unless you get all 5 members of the Security Council to vote unanimously on something, and that rarely happens. Yet we're facing a global problem. The CO2 doesn't care what country you're in. We're all going to suffer from the effects of climate change, but each country is looking at it from, well, as they usually do. How do we come out on top in all of this in the negotiations of what to do? Well, it's not really in our interest. My constituents don't believe in it, so I'm not even going to touch it. It's not going to get me reelected. International law is not at the moment strong enough to force countries into taking steps to protect human rights that will be disrupted by climate change. That's not even getting into the civil unrest that was probably going to emerge out of all of this breakdown of our infrastructure and our systems. Some areas devolving into anarchy. Now you're going to get into a disruption of your political rights, like your right to life, your right to freedom may be disrupted by that. What about the idea of finally green capitalism or eco-capitalism? Will that save us? That is hotly debated. A lot of commentators say no, that the idea of capitalism is perpetual growth and the planet can no longer sustain that. We've been trying it for a while, but so far it is not working. Now you can tell very easily by how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. At the moment, there is more CO2 in the atmosphere than at any time in human history. So it's not working. You can easily determine this. Finally, one of the problems behind this is if you want people to take action on a social issue, what they need to feel is disgust at what they're seeing, like the murder of innocents by abusive police, right? You catch it on video and people are morally outraged by what they see. Climate change is not quite like that. A rising sea level does not engender the same kind of moral disgust as kicking puppies, right? And it's more difficult to see. You can't see the carbon dioxide. And if you see the sea levels rising, maybe people don't feel like they know who to blame. That's just a storm. It's not, what are you supposed to do about it, So that's the lack of moral outrage is another problem that the world community is having and trying to motivate people to do something about this. So I didn't say it was going to be cheery, but I hope it was informative because this is a big deal. This is one more way to look at climate change through the human rights lens. And what we're seeing is daunting. And mankind is not yet ready to take on this challenge. It's probably going to have to get a little bit worse before people kind of are ready to sacrifice to do something about this. So, stop this. Does anybody have any questions I'd like to ask regarding any of this? I'll do my best.
How did you get interested in like studying this?
Like I said, human rights was my gig, studying the history of human rights. And over time, I've become interested in climate change because, I mean, well, really everybody should be. It's all of our business. And just one day, you know, it clicked on me that there's an intersection between the two. And I went out and started looking for the research and found it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Sure.
I had a question, David.
Sure.
I've done a little bit of research. I know there was talk about having climate refugees be a protected category, like internationally. I'm not sure where that stands. Could you talk a little bit about that?
There's discussion of it. The UN wants it passed. It has not been passed yet. Countries of the world do not want this to happen. Well, it depends on who you are. If you're one of these low-lying areas, you want it passed. But if you're not, if you're one of the wealthier countries and you know everybody's going to come to your country, they do not want this passed. They're very jealous of their borders, right, and determining who's going to come in. There's still not this sense among the world's nations that we're all in this together. And the UN, it can't impose these rules, right? People have to accept it, have to sign the treaties. So I think that's going to be in limbo for a long time, would be my guess.
Professor Bassano, in your research, could you comment on possible solutions to these problems that you've come across, number one? And number two, can you comment on, not everybody believes in global climate change, as you mentioned. Can you compare it to like a 1,000-year or over lifetime or past climate changes like the ice ages that came about as part of a normal, like a business cycle, I guess, a weather cycle?
Yeah. To address the second question first, have you ever heard of the hockey stick when it comes to anthropogenic climate change? Something called the hockey stick?
No.
Okay. When looking at how fast the CO2 and the temperatures are rising on planet Earth, what you see starting in the mid 50s is a very rapid increase. And the reason why it's called the hockey stick is if you look at the temperature, now the temperature is always up and down. It's not a steady thing, the climate temperature. It's a spiky looking thing. It's always up, down, up, down, up, down, one year to the next. And that's got to do with stuff like output from the sun and all this business. Except since the mid 50s, on the graph, if you look at it, it looks like a hockey stick all of a sudden, where it steeply rises over. What change that we've never seen, looking at things like ice core samples and tree rings, climatologists believe that there's never been so sudden an increase, and they go looking for what's the cause of that. And they can't find any other reason except for carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning. That's the only possibility that they can ascribe this to, trying to find anything else. So I think that's the proof that this is not natural. It's the hockey stick that proves it. Looking for solutions, yes, lots of people are talking about solutions. They're all pretty weak, I'm afraid. Well, we need the nations of the world to all get together and stop thinking about themselves as though, oh my God, if you know anything about international relations, just shoot me. Like, how could you even write that? You know, it's like, I hate to say it, but boy, you know, the world's going to have to really start suffering before they give up the independence of their different nations and so are all pulling together on that one. All they're doing now is pointing fingers. Oh, why should we do anything? China's not doing anything. That's their fault. And India needs to do this, and right, nothing's much is getting done. Others say we need to begin suing the corporations who are producing fossil fuels, saying that they're actually violating human rights by selling the fossil fuel in the first place. This gets into the big arguments, kind of like Americans say to the Colombians, right? Stop sending cocaine up here. And the Colombians say, stop buying it. Who's buying it? It would stop if you would stop, which is what Shell would say to that. So solutions are being put forward. At the moment, it's not looking real promising simply because the world's nations aren't scared enough yet. I think they got to get scared.
One more question. You commented how the difference between the rich and the poor nations. Obviously, we burn a lot of fossil fuels, but that's what makes us an industrial nation and our standard of living. You look at China and India, they're at where we were probably with the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1800s. They're burning coal. Is their fossil fuel consumption because of that way greater than ours? And is there a solution? Obviously, they don't have the money to do scrubbers on coal plants and all that like we do. What's the comparison of the CO2 we put out versus the CO2 China and India put out, or some of the other industrial nations?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with, you're right, that the kind of burning that's being done. Also population size, like we burn a lot more per capita than China and India do, but China has 4 times as many people. So it gets a little difficult to calculate. You know, all that CO2 looks the same once it gets up there. I think most studies are saying the United States is the main fossil fuel consumer. China comes second, and then it's India. And a lot of the Chinese government officials, a lot of them think that climate change is a hoax created by the Americans to keep their economy suppressed, because they know perfectly well the more fossil fuel you burn, the wealthier your economy becomes, right? It's the biggest bang. Burning fossil fuel is the biggest bang for your buck that we have. That's why we use it. For those, and China also has serious environmental problems from burning all the fossil fuel, and they're trying to square that circle, right? How do you keep the economy screaming along? And India and China both feel that problem because of their huge population. As Nehru of India put it, India needs to run as fast as it can to stay in one place because their population is expanding so constantly. So they're pressed for economic growth, and they're pressed to take care of the environment, and the environment seems to be losing. Yeah, I hope that answered the question somewhat. Anybody else? I'm here all week, no problem.
I just wanted to chime in and say that I've read, some interesting papers on how climate change is talked about and discussed in different nations, which is really fascinating to me. And, places like the Maldives, it's not like a question, like it's not, is climate change happening? It's no, what should we do? And, I think there's a lot of political, and it's interesting you bring up the example of China, and, there's so much nuance within each particular area in terms of how it's discussed. But I think, the science is very clear. And I often, speak of, because I teach composition, so we deal with rhetoric and fallacies, and it's, a fallacious argument to say either the climate is changing by itself, or we're changing it. Like both things are happening at the same time, and so there are a lot of debates that are put out into the public sphere that there aren't really, when you look at them logically, they don't really hold up to scrutiny. So I did want to just point that out. And,
The other thing is too, we human beings, we seem to be, through our evolutionary psychology, we're real good at immediate threats. Like when the dog is barking right in your face, then all of a sudden we snap to, fight or flight kicks in, and then we take some action. We're not real good at identifying long-term threats, especially when the threat is something that you'd really rather not look at, right? This is why, you identify the immediate dog barking in your face, but when the credit card bill comes at the end of the month, you look at it, oh my God, look at this bill. Oh, wait. Then you start to recognize, oh yeah, I made that one. But we didn't realize at the time what the long-term consequences were going to be. We don't seem to be programmed, say evolutionary psychologists. We've got a bit of a genetic problem when it comes to climate change. Yeah. Anybody else? No? What you think, Kelsey?
Oh, I was just saying Joe is muted if he was trying to ask a question.
You're muted, Joseph. Did you want to say something?
Oh,
No, I can't hear you. You're showing up as muted. Or type it in the chat if you like.
yeah, type in the chat. So just one more real quick question for me. So cap and trade. Oh, he lost the visual.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You made it through to the end. Oh, go ahead, Kelsey.
So cap and trade, you don't see really that being like a viable, way to help, or?
From what most of the scholars are saying is no, it's not
Mhm.
going to be able to handle this problem. That is a big, complicated issue. But cap and trade, trading credits for being able to burn stuff, most scholars say that's going to end up being used and abused to try to sneak off more. And it's fascinating to look at this politically, right? This won't spin, right? Politics is all about subjectivity. I'm going to spin the issue, and you have this opinion, I have that, and I'll play with this. Carbon dioxide does what carbon dioxide does, and it doesn't care about any of our views or opinions or any of it. It's chemistry, it's science working out. There's no way to dodge, there's no way to lie. And I think that's one of the problems we've got politically, is we're so used to handling our problems by, burying our head in the sand or kicking the can down the road, and we can't do that now. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, so I just wanted to let everybody know that I did put into the chat a few minutes ago a link to our spring events calendar on the website. There's a ton of information on there. Many events still to come related to the environmental theme that we're wrapping up this semester. There are also, you'll see on there, opportunities to participate in the Global Citizenship Project, the International Education Advisory Committee. I know that there are some students on the call. So if you are also interested in our Global Citizenship Distinction Program, I think the next meeting for that group will be the first Tuesday in March. We encourage you to also participate in that. And maybe Catherine may want to say something about the Innovation Network, whose students are also working on an activity at Brookdale. Catherine, if you want to unmute and say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've been one of the instigators of a group of students who meet. Originally, they were all members of a class, and eventually we were able to successfully have them become a certified club on campus. In this year, there's a cross-disciplinary activity going on where they're going to be planting various flora that will help sustain the habitation of butterflies as they migrate through the county. And they are going to be planting this sometime in the spring, probably after all the snow melts, near where we have the famous racehorse Regret, who won the Kentucky Derby. So I know there's several posters out and asking for sales tomorrow. I think there's a period of time when people can dial up and buy donations, which are seeds, which will be planted. So it's an interdisciplinary activity for students to be involved from various different backgrounds and to learn to work in a team for a cause. And so the students are really in charge of this, and we'll see where it takes us. We've been doing the TIN, the Innovation Network, for a number of years. We basically started back in 2015. So I'm excited now to see it at such a global scale.
And 10 was an outgrowth of the GCP, the Global Citizenship Project. So we're always excited about that, when we can grow and expand our programs and provide more opportunities for our students to have, really high impact activities and ways that they can understand the world around them and in ways that really make sense to the students, and they're able to kind of wrap their hands around it and get involved in a project. Kelsey, did you want to close
Yeah,
us out?
just on kind of a closing note, you know, part of, and just circling back to what David said about the outrage, and you know, it has to be a visceral experience where people are really, it's emotional, and part of that, you know, comes with presentations like the one that we've just seen. That is, it's sobering, it's alarming, it's upsetting, and then part of it also, we're doing a global read, and it's fiction. It's a whole genre called cli-fi, climate change fiction, short stories. And, you know, reading these stories really puts you in that moment of this catastrophe, which so many are experiencing, and we've already had tastes of it ourselves. So I just want to say, I applaud you all for coming and listening, and you know, looking at this reality. And I hope that you will continue to look at this reality and to share, you know, your feelings with others, and hopefully we can start to you know, have some change. I know it is a dire situation, but I want to have hope, and I want to, you know, and part of being an educator and being at Brookdale working with students does give me hope. And, you know, like Greta Thunberg's speech at the UN, I mean, I think there's a lot of people doing good work. So I hope that we can keep the focus on, you know, the forward, you know, holding in one sense, looking at the reality and being upset by it, because understanding that being upset is what, you know, spurs us to act. So, and I thank David for his, you know, making those connections so clear, because it really is all, you know, it's all in front of us. And the anthology name is Everything Change. It comes from a quote by the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood, because she said it's not climate change, it's everything change, like it affects everything. So I'll stop rambling now, but I just wanted to say there's, you know, I want to leave on a hopeful note as well, but not minimize the gravity and the seriousness of what we're talking about here.
I tried to type in your chat, but I just wanted to say thank you. It was very interesting and great lecture. I got you back. I don't know what happened. I lost visual for a while. I had nothing but a blank screen. Thank you.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you for coming.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you,
Professor
everybody.
Bassano.
Everybody
Have a good
day.
afternoon.
Good afternoon.
A lot of thank yous coming in the chat. That was great.